Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Brother and sister, welcome back to Islamic Notes channel. No one knew that a small step up a mountain could open the door to heaven. An American climber, initially only seeking the summit, instead discovered something far more valuable than gold, a light that led him to Islam. How did a quiet cave on a snowy peak change his life forever? This is his story. Andrew Miller stood in the shadow of the Blue Rocky Mountains. He was only 32 years old, but his body had faced cold, snow, and storms countless times. He was no novice climber. He was a summit conqueror, a thrill seeker, and a limitless explorer. But this time, Andrew was climbing for more than just the heights. Since his mother's death a year earlier, his mind had been in turmoil. All his achievements felt empty. Every night in town, he lay awake staring at the sky, asking, "Is this the right life?" That winter, he decided to return to the mountains, carrying a large backpack, a tent, and the determination to climb alone. His friend said, "Andrew is crazy." The route he chose was untested, and the snow started falling early. But Andrew simply replied, "I want to find something. Maybe up there I'll find the answer." There was no treasure map in his hand, no gold he was after, just a peak, a silence, and a silent prayer he wasn't sure to whom. Beyond the high cliffs, a cold wind slapped his cheeks. But Andrew kept going, because beneath the frost, his heart began to feel warm. For some reason, he was sure this journey would give him something, though he didn't yet know what. The snow began to fall harder as Andrew climbed the narrow path along the cliffside. His breath was white, and the pack on his back grew heavier. He had spent the days hiking alone, only encountering wild deer, bare tracks in the mud, and the howling wind in his ears. On the third morning, Andrew stopped at the edge of a rocky cliff. He stood gazing out at the valley below, shrouded in a thin mist. His eyes were fixed, but his mind was spinning. Why am I here? What am I really looking for? His footsteps led him down a path that wasn't even marked on the map. The path descended slightly, skirting the cliffside. At the end, Andrew spotted a dark depression, like the opening of a small cave hidden behind dry brush. He paused, staring at the cave entrance with curiosity. It felt strange. On a mountain this high, on a rarely traveled path, there was suddenly a cave. It was as if something was guiding him there. Andrew put down his backpack, held his flashlight, and slowly approached. A cold wind blew softly, as if whispering in his ear, "Come in." Andrew stood at the entrance of the cave. His heartbeat quickened. He didn't know what he would find inside. But for the first time in his life, he felt like his footsteps weren't just his own. He turned on his small flashlight. The dim yellow light bounced off the cold, damp stone walls. His footsteps echoed softly, piercing the eerie yet calming silence. The cave's interior was larger than he had expected. Andrew bent down and felt the walls, noticing strange marks, faint scratches, stone markings. Some looked like symbols, not just natural scratches. He delved deeper. As he got deeper, the sound of the wind disappeared, replaced by a silence that made his own breathing sound loud. In the corner of the cave, Andrew was stunned. Something froze him, a flat pile of stone. On top of it lay a thin, fragile sheet of wood with strange writing on it. Andrew crouched down. He held the piece of wood gently, afraid of breaking it. The writing on its surface looked like Arabic script. Although he couldn't quite recognize it, next to it was a small, semicircular stone, like a miniature mihrab, oriented toward a single point. Andrew sat cross-legged. His hands trembled, not from the cold, but from the sense of wonder pressing down on his chest. Who once lived here? Why is there writing like this? Andrew suddenly felt warm in the freezing temperature. It was as if the cave were embracing him. For the first time, his heart felt at peace. There was no city noise, no burden, only silence whispering answers. Andrew stared at the writing. Although he didn't understand a single letter, his chest felt full, like a thirsty person finding a drop of water in the desert. In that silent cave, he didn't yet know that his life would change forever. Andrew sat leaning against the cave wall. His small flashlight was dim, but enough to highlight the unfamiliar letters on the brittle wood. He took a photo of the writing with his phone, hoping to look it up online later when he made it down the mountain. The wind from the cave entrance blew softly, carrying the scent of wet earth. In the silence, Andrew felt like he wasn't alone. There was a strange feeling, as if someone was watching him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end, but strangely, he wasn't afraid. Slowly, Andrew closed his eyes. In his mind, his mother's face flashed. She used to gaze at the stars from the porch, whispering prayers Andrew never understood. He remembered her words, "If you're confused, go to a quiet place. There, answers await you." His heartbeat grew louder. Then out of nowhere, Andrew heard a whisper. It wasn't a real voice, but like words coming from his heart. "Read, seek, you're not alone." Andrew was startled. His eyes widened. He stared at the written wood again. The word "read" echoed in his head, reminding him of a short documentary he had once watched about a prophet in the desert who received his first revelation in a cave. Andrew had never taken that story seriously, but now in this frozen cave thousands of miles from the Arabian desert, the word "read" seemed to transcend the barriers of time and space. With trembling hands, Andrew reached for his backpack. He opened the Notes app on his phone and wrote down the word, Iqra. He didn't know if he spelled it correctly, but that night, in the cave, that single word began to open the doors of his mind. He realized he might not find gold in this mountain, but behind the stone wall, he had found something far more precious, a truth that was slowly calling to him. The night wind penetrated the cave entrance, piercing his bones. Andrew lit a small fire from the dry wood he had found in his backpack. The flames danced in the corners of the rocks, casting moving shadows on the cave walls, as if the ancient letters on the wood were alive and speaking. Andrew sat cross-legged, his knees pressed to his chest. The temperature was piercing, but his mind remained warm, busy replaying memories. He opened his phone trying to find a signal. Nothing. He wrote again in his digital notes. What does Iqra mean? Who is the prophet in the cave? Why am I here? Slowly, fear was replaced by longing for answers, for peace. That night, in the dark belly of the mountain, Andrew spoke to himself. God, if you really exist, show me the way home. Not just down the mountain, but back to where you want me to be. The fire began to dim. The wind made the flames dance, then slowly extinguished. It was pitch black. Only the sound of Andrew's heartbeat could be heard. In the darkness, he felt something comforting him, like a hug. For the first time since his mother died, Andrew felt less alone. Tears fell silently from his eyes. That long night, Andrew didn't sleep. He sat leaning against a rock, staring at the black cave entrance. In the darkness, he felt as if he heard whispers of verses he didn't understand, but they soothed his heart, like the prayers of his mother who had always lulled him to sleep. In the cold, Andrew finally closed his eyes. Fatigue, fear, and peace all mixed together. And in his first dream in the cave, Andrew saw a faint light, but enough to show him the way out of the darkness of his life. The morning in the mountains was bitterly cold, but the sun's rays slowly broke through the blue sky. Andrew woke up, his body aching, leaning against the cold rock. Before him, sunlight crept into the cave mouth, illuminating the piece of wood with the inscription, as if deliberately highlighting it. Andrew reached for his phone. He tried once more to find a signal. Instantly, a single signal appeared. Weak but enough. With trembling hands, he opened a search engine. He typed in a single word, Iqra. Seconds later, page after page of Arabic words appeared. Andrew read slowly. Iqra means read. He read again, about the first words revealed to Muhammad in the cave of Hira, about the revelation, about the light in the desert, about the message from heaven. Andrew was lost in thought. His chest trembled. He stared out of the cave. The snow glistened in the sunlight. Everything felt right. It was as if this mountaintop were his own cave of Hira. Unconsciously, tears welled up in his eyes. He remembered his mother again. She used to stare up at the night sky, whispering prayers. Andrew never paid any attention, but now amidst the snow and frozen rock, he felt as if she were sitting beside him, whispering the same prayer. God, if you exist, show me the way home. Andrew whispered silently. His heart felt free. There was no sound, only the sound of the wind passing by his ears. But beneath it all, Andrew felt as if he had received an answer. "I'm here. You just need to read." Andrew took a deep breath. For the first time in his life, he felt the meaning of surrender. The peak he had been chasing all this time was not on the mountain, but in his own heart. That morning, Andrew sat for a long time at the cave entrance, rereading the fragile piece of wood in his lap. He knew the journey home would never be the same. He didn't know how yet, but he knew the way. After 2 days in the silent cave, Andrew stood at the entrance, packing his backpack. He carefully tucked the piece of wood with the inscription into his inner pocket. To anyone else, it might have been just a fragment of an ancient artifact, but to Andrew it was a sign, a door, and a light. His footsteps descended the narrow path along the cliffside. Snow still clung to his boots. The cold still slapped his cheeks. But in his chest there was a strange warmth he had never felt in a city, in a bar, at a party, or on any mountaintop before. Every now and then he would stop, look up at the blue sky, and utter a word that wasn't yet fluent on his tongue, but felt close to his heart. Allah. At the foot of the mountain, he met other climbers. Some stared in surprise at Andrew carrying a worn backpack and an old piece of wood he guarded as if it were gold. But Andrew just smiled, because he knew, this time he was descending the mountain not as a conqueror of a peak, but as a conqueror of the darkness within himself. A few weeks later, in a small town, Andrew sat in a corner of the library. His phone was full of search tabs about Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, the Cave of Hira, and the word Iqra. He emailed an imam at a nearby mosque asking for a time to meet. On Friday, Andrew stood at the back of the prayer line. His hands trembled. His heart trembled. He heard the holy verses being recited, and the word read seemed to fill his head again. After the sermon, Andrew approached the imam. In a low voice, he recited, Shahada. There was no tolling of bells, no cheers. Only tears fell, washing away the darkness in his heart. It wasn't gold he found on the mountain, but light. And from then on, every time he climbed again, Andrew knew every step on earth only brought him closer to heaven. In the days following the Shahada, Andrew's life changed slowly, like a still river eroding a rock. He still lived in that small town, renting a simple room near the mosque. In the mornings, he walked to the morning prayer. Arabic still sounded foreign to his ears. The movements of prayer still felt stiff in his body, but his heart was no longer empty. Every verse he heard seemed to be a brick in the rebuilding of his life. In his spare time, Andrew sat for hours in the library or on the mosque terrace, reading translations of the Quran, listening to sermons on YouTube, jotting down new words that once sounded foreign. Mercy, Tawheed, Istiqamah, guidance. Sometimes he would stop reading and simply look up at the sky, letting the words settle in his heart. Why didn't I know all this before? He thought, but then he smiled a little, because perhaps it took a snowstorm and the silence of a cave for him to truly hear. Every night he wrote about his journey. In digital notes in a small journal he always carried in his bag, he wrote not just facts, but feelings. The feeling he felt when he first heard the call to prayer. His first impressions of prayer. The prayers he said in English, but with a heart that was beginning to know God. He also wrote a letter to his mother, not to send, but to read for himself. Mom, you were right. The answer lies in a quiet place, and now I know that answer is not a voice, but a light. 3 months after converting to Islam, Andrew returned to climbing, but this time it wasn't to search. He had found it. He carried a small copy of the Quran in his backpack, along with a thin prayer mat and an old piece of wood from the cave, which he now had framed in a glass case. His steps were lighter, even though the path he traversed was more difficult. He climbed not to challenge nature, but to greet the sky again. And when he reached the same spot, the small cave that led him to Islam, Andrew sat down and wept. Not out of fear, not out of fatigue, but out of longing. He felt like he was coming home. He spread out his prayer mat, faced the Qibla, and for the first time he prayed on the mountain that had once been only a place of escape. Now the mountain had become a place of encounter. Amidst the rustling of the wind and the distant call of eagles, Andrew prostrated himself. There was no imam, no loudspeaker, just him and Allah. And as he rose from prostration, he whispered, "I used to climb to see the world from above. Now I prostrate so the sky can see me from below." As night fell, Andrew sat leaning against a large rock. He lit a small fire, opened the Quran, and read slowly, though still stuttering. The wind carried his words, the heavens heard them. He looked up, and in a quiet prayer he said, "God, I don't have much, but I have a heart that wants to stay close. Don't let me get lost again. If I forget, remind me. If I get tired, strengthen me. If I fall, lift me back up." The next day he descended the mountain, not as a man seeking answers, but as a man ready to be part of the answers himself. He returned to the city and wrote a book about his experience. He titled it, The Silent Summit, From Snow to Shahada. The book was not just a story of climbing, but a story of a soul traveling the arduous path toward light. He was invited to various places, mosques, churches, universities, to tell about his journey, not to convert anyone, but to convey a simple message. If your heart is restless, don't fight it. Listen. Sometimes that's God's way of speaking to you. A few years later, Andrew married a female convert from Canada. They settled near the mountains, building a small house with a backyard garden and bookshelves filled with copies of the Quran in various translations. They had a son. His name was Noor. It means light. Every night before bed, Andrew sat beside his son's bed and said, "Dad used to look for gold in the mountains, but Allah gave me you, and that's more than anything." And from then on, Andrew no longer climbed just to see the world from above. He climbed to remember that in the silence and snow, Allah had once knocked on the door of his heart and changed his life forever. Years passed. Andrew was no longer a man lost in the snow and loneliness. He was someone firmly on the path God had chosen for him. Every morning he sweeps the yard of his small house surrounded by pine trees. He waters the flowers he and his wife planted. Then he prepares breakfast for Noor, his only child, who can now memorize short chapters of the Quran and recite it with a tartil far better than his own father. Andrew smiles every time he hears that little voice recite, "Iqra bismi rabbik." It wasn't just a verse, it was a turning point in his life, a single word that shook the snow in his soul and planted a garden in his chest. But life as a convert isn't always easy. Many nights Andrew spends contemplating alone in his study, staring at a laptop screen filled with drafts. He remembers his old friends, some who have drifted away since he converted to Islam. He remembers his father, who hasn't contacted him since receiving news of his decision to convert to Islam. On the one hand, his life is filled with light. On the other, there's still the shadow of loss. But that's where Andrew learns patience, about contentment, about how Hijra wasn't just about changing one's faith, but leaving one's comfort zone for something he didn't fully understand, but believed in. And like the mountain he once climbed, he climbed Islam with the same passion, step by step, falling, getting up, and then continuing again. One afternoon at the mosque in the town where he lived, Andrew gave a light sermon. It wasn't about fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, or tafsir, Islamic interpretation, but about experience, about finding Islam in silence, in solitude, in a cave. The audience, converts, truth seekers, and even Muslims born into Islam but lost their way, was silent. He wasn't a good preacher, but he was honest, and that honesty touched them. "You know," he said quietly, "God doesn't just speak through pulpits and books. Sometimes he speaks through fatigue, loss, or silence. Sometimes we can only truly hear when there's no other voice to distract us."